Hey everyone, I am Kristen Kilpatrick, and for my ethical dilemma case study, I chose the topic of law enforcement agencies seeking results from privately owned genetic genealogy testing firms when the federal combined DNA index system, or CODIS, is not yielding results or leads in investigations. Some examples of these privately owned genetic genealogy testing firms include 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and GED Match. So, for some background information, private genealogy testing firms offer products that offer comprehensive breakdowns of things such as ancestry and health information in exchange for the consumer's DNA sample from saliva for testing. Companies like 23andMe rose in popularity in the late 2000s and early 2010s, even being named Time Magazine's 2008 Invention of the Year for their exceptional work in making personal genealogy accessible and affordable. DNA collection and profiling is a vital aspect of modern law enforcement investigations because they use DNA for things like victim identification, exonerating innocent suspects, and most importantly, identifying suspects of crime through biological evidence left behind at crime scenes like blood, saliva, semen, or hair. The use of DNA has become a powerful tool for law enforcement agencies. The FBI writes that to further the use of DNA in solving crime, the Federal Bureau of Investigation created a system of DNA profile indexes, the Combined DNA Index System, which I will be referring to as CODIS. This system, officially activated in October of 1998, allows participating forensic laboratories to compare DNA profiles with the goal of matching case evidence to other previously unrelated cases where the person's already convicted of specific crimes. CODIS obviously does not have everybody's DNA, so although many crime scenes have plenty of DNA samples of the suspected perpetrator, law enforcement is forced to wait until the assailant's DNA is entered into the system at a later date or until they find different leads in the investigation. With the popularity of privately owned genetic genealogy testing firms, kits being sold across the United States, more and more consumers are offering their DNA to be added to the private companies' databases with only the intention of utilizing the product for their information requests regarding their private ancestry and health. But now they're being faced with wondering if law enforcement agencies can gain access to these DNA samples to connect themselves or their family members to crimes. Which short answer is yes. This brings up concerns for privacy, since there are no obvious limiting principles associated with using these companies' databases, concerns for those being tested, concerns for family members associated with the searches, concerns for people falsely accused of crime, and concerns for how this could be used to continue racial profiling or over policing. Individual decisions to obtain and share DNA profiles have implications for relatives. Research has suggested that a majority of Americans of European descent can be identified through such sites, even if they have not submitted their own DNA. This brings me to my ethical dilemma. Is it ethical for law enforcement agencies to seek results from privately owned genetic genealogy testing firms when the federal combined DNA index system, CODIS, is not yielding results or leads? The first case that I think is beneficial when examining this ethical dilemma is the case of the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer was a rapist and murderer known to have murdered at least 12 victims from 1974 to 1986. This was a cold case until 2018. There was DNA found at the crime scene, but none of it was a match to anyone in CODIS, so it was considered a dead end until law enforcement compared the DNA found to GED match, where they used genealogy to reconstruct the family tree that included the DNA profile. After figuring out which person in the family was most likely to be the Golden State Killer, the police secretly surveilled him until they were able to take a DNA sample from a discarded tissue and swab from the inside of a door handle to conclusively match him to the DNA of one of the crime scenes. After this, he was arrested and charged with the murders. Something similar to this, to the Golden State Killer, took place with the Idaho killer case, where 4 University of Idaho students were murdered in November of 2022, but there is yet to be a trial to take place, therefore no one has been convicted of the crimes yet. The FBI put the DNA profile gathered by the knife sheath into public genealogy sites and began constructing family trees of the genetic relatives of the suspect to hopefully determine the suspect's identity. I believe that the ethical approach that we are currently seeing being used is utilitarianism. Birch defines utilitarianism as an ethical theory that asserts that what is morally good is what produces more pleasure or happiness than pain or unhappiness for the persons affected, and what is morally bad produces more pain or unhappiness than pleasure or happiness for the persons affected. I believe that this is an effective evaluation of the ethical dilemma because the act of utilizing DNA to solve crimes will bring closure to families, justice for victims, and safety to the community, making a large amount of people happy. Consequences of this approach include the potential violation and circumventing of the right to privacy. But I still think that this is the ethical approach that I would answer the ethical dilemma question with. I also think that the just intelligence principles could be used to answer this ethical dilemma. Just intelligence theory is used to determine if and when those harms are justified. And I believe that the harm of violating the suspected criminal's privacy is justified under the just intelligence principles. This is how I would examine the principles under the hypothetical of a law enforcement agency using results from privately owned genetic genealogy testing firms in the case of solving a cold case murder, since those are the kinds of cases that we see most often that utilize this kind of strategy in investigation. So, first, with just cause, there is a sufficient threat to justify the harm of violating the suspect's right to privacy. Authority. Law enforcement agency does have legitimate authority, especially since it represents the community's safety interest. Right intentions. The objective is to solve the crime, and it is not for political, social, or other economic objectives. Last resort. This the less harmful or non-harmful act that um, could take place would be running the DNA found at the crime scene through CODIS, and assuming that this is a cold case murder, then we've exhausted all other leads through doing that already. Proportionality. The gains, which are bringing a family closure, securing justice for a victim, and getting an unsafe criminal off the streets, outweigh the perceived harm of violating privacy. In discrimination, the only illegitimate targets would be people that are not guilty and are still being searched. A consequence of this ethical approach would also be the harm to privacy. So, the next ethical approach that could be considered is the moral rights theory, which can be defined by Birch as an ethical theory that asserts that persons can make valid moral claims that are related to other people's moral duties. People act ethically when they fulfill their moral duties and unethically when they do not fulfill their moral duties or violate other persons' rights. One of the moral rights of that an individual possesses is the right to privacy. So, privacy can be defined as control over personal information about and access to a person, which is limited by relationships and settings. Birch also writes that the government has a moral duty not to interfere with individuals' legitimate control over personal information about themselves and access to themselves in private space. I believe that this dilemma would be considered unethical um, under this approach because the government would violate other people's rights, the right to privacy. A consequence of this ethical theory being used would be that it lacks the perspective of the benefits of using this technique to bring justice to victims who lost their right to the security of a person due to the suspect's actions. The final ethical approach that I believe should be considered would be Kantian ethics. Kantian ethics is defined by Birch as an ethical theory that is grounded in actions based on legitimate moral rules connected to moral duty, or that focuses on reasoning that precedes an action to determine whether that action is ethical. A good action is performed because it is the person's moral duty to do it, not because of self interest, personal preference, or to achieve certain results. The third step in the Kantian ethical procedure is to determine whether anyone was simply used as a means to accomplish the ends of others. I believe that this dilemma would be considered unethical because the government would be using a family member's DNA to create a lead in an investigation by using that person as a means to accomplish the ends of others. Consequences for this action would be similar to those of moral rights theory since it doesn't truly account for the positives that come out of solving crimes. So that concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reply to this discussion post. I can't wait to hear your thoughts and ideas regarding this complex issue, and I think that the debate surrounding the theoretical approaches will be super interesting. So I look forward to that. Here are my sources, but they will also be linked in the replies. Please let me know if you have trouble accessing them, and I'd be happy to email you. Thank you again for your time, and I hope you have an amazing week.